Well, I'm interrupting it a little bit this week. I'm going through and following, trying to follow a schedule that's going to get us through most of the Bible. But Matt touched on the miracle story at Cana not too long ago, so I was like, I don't want to do that again. So I'm gonna skip that and do something a little different this morning. Instead of having a text-focused sermon, I'm gonna kind of have more of a topical sermon, something that I believe rather strongly about, and that is worship. When I was growing up, I heard, this is probably not an exaggeration, 150 sermons against instrumental music and worship. It's probably not an exaggeration. And you know, what I wish I would have heard is a sermon in arguing for a cappella music. And that's what I'm going to do this morning. I'm going to tell you why I believe that a cappella worship is the right thing for the church to do. The first question is, why have music and worship at all? Isn't it, because we're kind of in the environment, it's kind of odd. It doesn't strike us as odd, but it actually is kind of odd. Why does God want music? What does music have to do with the divine? What does music have to do with us? Why does God want us to sing at all? Well, one of the things that's unique about music is it models something about life that really we can latch on to. The way that life works is you kind of got two extremes. You've got order, where your life is so strict and regimented that I'm sure some of you have calendars I could look at right now that you've got so lined out that it's one thing after another, and if you're not like me, you stick to it. But then you've got the other end of the spectrum, where your life is a complete mess, where you can't get anything done on time, where you've got order on this side and you've got chaos, complete chaos, and nobody can thrive when they're at the very extreme of either of those. If your life is so regimented that there's not space for creative work, where there's not space for you to really enjoy the things around you, to have some flexibility, that'll kill you. And if your life is so chaotic that there's no security in your life, that'll kill you too. But if you can find the edge, somewhere in the middle, where there's just enough order and just enough chaos in your life to where you're not bored out of your mind because your life is so regimented, but you're also not drowning because there's not so much chaos in your life that you can't handle. You can really thrive in that space. And music is a model of that. You know, there are rules to music. There are rules to how chords work. There are rules to how notes fit together. You don't just throw notes on a page and hope and think it'll sound good. There are rules to music. And patterns. You know, you've probably noticed that if you turn on the radio, almost all popular songs kind of sound the same. They start to blend together. Because it's because there are patterns that our brains kind of like and we recognize. Well, the way that music works is it takes these patterns that we're expecting and these rules and then plays with them a little bit. Throws some things that we don't expect every once in a while. Music itself is kind of this model of life where there's just enough order and just enough chaos. And I think that's one of the reasons human beings have been drawn to it since they've existed. It models what life is supposed to be like. And I think God knows that. I think when He tells us to sing, He knows that music will do that for us. But why a cappella music? Well, there are a couple things that I want to say about the a cappella part of the music. if you look back in the history of religious development, not just Jewish or Christian religious development, but religious development as a whole, instruments start getting used as a means of getting God's attention. And so in many pagan religions, you have banging on drums to wake up the gods. You'll have, there's so many different examples that I could go on and on. But the main purpose of the introduction of instruments into worship was to get God's attention in the pagan world. And one of the things I think it does for us is it gives us a claim that God is already listening to us. We don't have to get His attention. We just have to speak. We don't have to make a noise to wake God up. We have a God who sees and hears. And it proclaims that in our assembly. That we show up and we speak and God listens. Another thing that I think acapella music specifically does for us is it connects us to our history. And I'm not talking just the history of the Churches of Christ or the history of this church. I'm talking about the history of the church from the very beginning. Behind me, this is a church in Damascus, a very, very old church in Damascus. And the way that the early Christians did it is they would worship without instruments, but that was mostly because it was actually kind of by accident. What they did is they adopted the structure of the synagogue. So synagogues were started in Babylonian captivity. Before then, there were no synagogues. And in Babylonian captivity, when the temple was destroyed, they said, all right, we need to find a new way to worship. And they started meeting in these kind of public buildings and sometimes homes. And they would have elders and they would have deacons. They would have, it's very similar to the structure that the early church adopted because that's what they were used to. But in the synagogues in Babylonian captivity, they said, we're not going to use instruments. They used instruments in the temple. But in Babylonian captivity, they said, we're not going to use instruments. And the reason they did it was because it's not right for us to celebrate when Jerusalem is in ruins. And so the reason that the synagogue worship didn't have it was out of respect for Jerusalem. That was the reason that it was not adopted. Well, that continues on into the first century, and that continues on in the church for most of its history. What this does is it gives us a connection with our history. One of my favorite hymns is a Christmas song, O Come, Emmanuel. And the first written record we have of that song is from like the 1100s, but it's got to be older than that because you don't write a song down until it's well known. There are these songs that Christians have been singing in the same way that we sing them for a very, very long time. And when I think about that, it's even more recent. I think about, especially when I get out like old songbooks, I think about, and I'm singing out of them, I think, my grandparents sang this song. My great-grandparents sang this song. And there's something special about this connection to our history, how this tradition that we follow is faithful to what the early Christians themselves would have done. It unites us with them. I think it's kind of a beautiful thing. Another thing that acapella music does for us is it gives us what I call a unifying aesthetic. There's a Catholic scholar who does a lot of work on worship styles. He does a lot of research on different churches doing worship. And one of the things that he says, and he's a Catholic, he's not one of us, but he says, the Churches of Christ have something unique. And he says, and I think that the rest of the Christian world could learn from them. I'll just tell you what he said. He says, the Churches of Christ adopt new songs, but when they do, they bring it in line with the rest of their repertoire. So one of the problems that the instrumental world has had to deal with a little bit is they've had to deal with these newer songs that have different instrumentation. How do we incorporate them into worship? And some people have split services. They'll have like a traditional service where you have the piano or the organ accompanying singing, and then you'll have a contemporary service where you have the guitar and the drums and all that stuff to kind of do. But the problem is, to put those side by side is actually jarring to us. It actually is jarring. It's almost like putting hot sauce on ice cream. Two things don't go together very well. Well, what a cappella singing does is it takes these old songs, these songs that connect us to our history, and it can also take these new songs and put them together in a way that's like putting chocolate syrup on ice cream. It's a way that putting these things together works, doesn't jar us as much. And that might not seem like a big deal, but our worship and our experience and what praise is supposed to do really is a big deal. And having this tool to be able to take songs very readily and put them in worship is, I think, an advantage that a cappella singing gives us. Another advantage that a cappella singing gives us is the ability to worship anytime, anywhere. We don't have to have any equipment. We don't have to have any... we just have to have people. And people can do it. Not only that, though, this also kind of, I think, fosters an anytime, anywhere attitude. Not just that we can do it anytime, anywhere, but it also encourages us to do it anytime, anywhere. Now, I say this a little bit out of experience. For a couple of years, I worked for a congregation that had, I worked for the Air Force Base, and at the Air Force Base in the chapel, on Sundays, they use instruments in their worship. And what I found in that time was when I would try and, let's do worship in like devotionals with the children I was working with. I remember our first walk-in, we were going to do some worship, and I started to do it, and the kids were just confused. It wasn't something they were used to. You worship in church. You didn't sing really anywhere else. They were used to Bible study. These kids would study the Bible with me at any time, and they would eat it up. But when it came to worshiping outside of that setting, it was very foreign to them. Now, that's not to say that that's the case everywhere. In fact, my grandmother would be an example of how she was raised in a primitive Baptist church where they used instruments, and her sisters, they would sing all the time. They sang on the radio, But in my experience, especially nowadays, the use of instruments in congregations actually, or maybe I'll say it this way. A cappella singing, I think, promotes a culture of worship in a way that instrumental music doesn't. That, at least in my experience. And so, not only can we do it anytime, anywhere, I think that a cappella worship actually encourages us to do it anytime, anywhere. And lastly, and most importantly to me, a cappella worship, I think, embodies the life of the church. Ephesians chapter 5, we read it this morning. It says, "Look carefully how you walk, not as unwise but as wise, making the best use of your time, for the days are evil. Therefore do not be foolish, but understand what the will of the Lord is. And do not get drunk with wine, for that is debauchery, but be filled with the Spirit. addressing one another with psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs, singing and making melody with your heart to the Lord, giving thanks always and for everything to God the Father in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, submitting to one another out of the reverence for Christ. The way that the church is supposed to work is this kind of, it's a family. It really is. It's a family. It's a body. These metaphors that Paul used to describe the church are, I think, apt. And so you've got people who are different. We all come from different places, different backgrounds, different skill sets, we're different people. But we work together. We live in community. We submit to one another. I love that's included in there. We submit to one another. We have to get along. We have to realize that maybe our perspective isn't always ultimate. Our perspective isn't always right. We have to, there are these things that we do as the church. We work with one another, and we don't do it for no reason. We're doing it all for the glory of God. We're doing it so we can be a community that witnesses to the world who God is. We're supposed to be we're working on taking all of our broken lives, and broken selves and imperfect selves, and working together to make something beautiful that does the will of God, that the world can look at and say, that's what the kingdom of God is supposed to look like. And we're working on that. We're working on it together. And each of us has a part to do. And acapella worship actually is a picture of that. We come together on Sunday morning to worship. And we all come with our own baggage. We all come with different levels of skill in terms of worship, in terms of musicality. We come and we raise our voices, whether they're in tune or not, to try and make something beautiful. To try and make something for our Lord. And we have to submit to one another. You don't get to pick your own key. Well, sometimes you do. You don't get to pick your own key. We blend together. We submit to one another in this exercise. It's almost as if the worship that we do is a practice run for being the church. That we can take what we've got. Maybe you're the best musician who's ever lived. Maybe you're not at all. But we can take what we've got, put it together with other people, and make an offering. Try and make something beautiful. And that's what God is doing with the church. Takes us in our broken offering as we work together and tries to make something beautiful out of it. I think a cappella singing is important to the health of the church. I think it is a tradition that is worth preserving. And I think it's a theological act. It's an act of worship that I think that we might need to understand the deep significance of it a little bit more than we have in the past. And I think tying it to the gospel, tying it to our history, tying it to all the things that in reality is tied to, I hope it will improve your own worship experience. To know that as you're praising God in song, you're kind of in that model of chaos and order with rules and surprise. You're in that model of what the church could be. You're encouraging a culture of worship. You're encouraging a life of worship. And I think a cappella music does this for us in a way that I think other traditions don't do as well. And so this is my, this is it. This is my argument. This is why I believe that acapella music is an important part of the life of the church. Maybe this morning you need to commit yourself to the life of the church. Maybe you need to say that I need to submit my will to Christ and begin working with us, working together, submitting to one another as well to build up the purposes of God. If that's a commitment you want to make this morning, this is the time. Maybe you did that a long time ago, but you've faltered. Maybe you've gotten off the path. If that's something you need to take care of, that's something we can help you with as well. If you have any need, would you please come as we stand, as we sing.